Okay, let's get started, everybody. Okay, all right, let's continue our discussion.
All right, let's get started. We'll be talking about spending again today and the various ways that different groups of people in society spend money. And the two groups we'll look at this morning are men and women, a favorite topic for many people. And I'm going to cover some of the different ways that men and women spend money and then discuss some of the reactions by businesses to these differences. So we're going to see lots of differences, and the main reason I want to focus on gender differences in spending is because these differences are starting to have very big implications for marketers and advertisers. Now, I'm speaking in generalizations here, but traditionally, the wife and mother in a family has been the one in the family who has been concerned with taking care of the home and taking care of the children. So, for example, it's traditionally the woman in the family who thinks about preparing the food for the family or keeping the family healthy and warm, those kinds of things. Here's how experts say it. They say women want to create a lifestyle. Now that means they tend to focus on the daily life of their family. Another way we can say this is women have traditionally focused more on now. So when we think about spending money, the traditional purchases made by women have been things like the daily food for the family, and the shoes, and the clothes. These kinds of purchases are made for the daily needs of the family for right now. Now, let's move on and let's talk about the traditional responsibilities and traditional spending by men. Traditionally, and again, this is a generalization, the man in the family is the one who fixes things. So, for example, if a door in the house is broken, the man fixes it, okay? So now, when it comes to spending, well, men traditionally want to get those things that will last a long time and that don't need replacing or repairing. They're the ones who are concerned with the long-term value of purchases. And that makes quite a bit of sense. Now, the long-term value of an item increases as the price of the item goes up. So the long-term value of a car, for example, is more important to a family's finances than, let's say, the long-term value of a sweater or a pair of shoes. So items with a high long-term value have been important to men. So now we're going to look at big ticket items. Okay? And we sometimes call these expensive items with long-term value the big ticket items. So big ticket items like cars, refrigerators, televisions, electronic equipment, they're the things that last a long time. They have a longer value, so because men usually made the decision about the big ticket items, the experts have traditionally considered men to be more focused on the future in their spending behavior. All right, so up to now, I've given you a picture of the traditional differences in the way men and women think about and spend money. So we have women now and men future. Okay? We said women think more about now and men think more about the future. Good. And up to now, you've seen that I've been using the word traditional and traditionally. Why? Because much of what I've said is changing. And change is right before our eyes. The traditional responsibilities in the family are changing. And as a result of these changes, we see many businesses that are now changing the way they market their products. Okay? Good. Now, Let's take a look at some numbers. Today, 27% of all households in the United States are now headed by a single woman. Okay? That means that there's no man in the house in over a quarter of the homes in the United States. Let's think about that. That is one big change. But the other big change has come about because these days women are working outside the home. That means they're earning money on their own, right? They're making their own money. So, as a result, many of these women want to have a say in how the family money is spent. And the research shows this. 75% household purchases are made by women. Purchases. Okay? And 80% of the women make purchasing decisions. Okay? So this is done by women. Now, there was a major poll done in the United States recently, and they found that women now control 75% of household finances, and they control 80% of purchasing decisions. Now, let me share some more specific research. So 62% of women make the car purchases. All right? So there's some new market research that shows that women in the United States now decide 62% of car purchases. I'll add that we also have studies that shows that more and more women are helping to make the decisions about how to repair and improve the house as well. So all of this is telling us that they have helped to make decisions about some of the big ticket items that we mentioned before. Now, these are very important changes because if you remember, we said earlier, these used to be the purchases made by men. Well, not anymore. I think I've given you an idea of the change in men and women spending, and especially the change in the spending by women. All right, so now what I want to ask is, what does this all mean for business? How has the business world responded? Okay, we have something called female economy. Okay, female economy is a way to talk about the new kinds of spending. Okay, the new kind of purchasing that's being done by women. And one big result of this female economy is a movement in more and more businesses to become more female friendly. Now, female friendly basically means to run a business that is more comfortable and more attractive to women. So, research shows that companies are discovering that women are making new kinds of purchases. They're buying products they didn't buy before, and companies are changing the way they market their products in order to try to appeal to their new consumers, women. All right, now I want to show you an excellent example of what I mean by female friendly. There's a car repair company that has shops all over the United States. It's called Jiffy Lube. Now remember, we said that women were starting to buy their own cars, okay? The people at Jiffy Lube wanted to be sure that women went to their company to have their cars fixed. So they made some changes in their business. To appeal to women, they built nice, comfortable waiting rooms with soft, comfortable chairs for their customers to use. Okay? They added magazines that women might like to read in the waiting room. And this is the interesting part. They taught their workers how to explain their car services clearly and carefully so that their new customers, women, could understand. To do all of this, they spent $8 million, okay? And this is all to appeal to women. All right, I'm going to stop here for today. We've seen from these examples that the new female economy is something businesses are taking very seriously. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of money for businesses to make in this market. Now, next time, I'll give you a few more case studies of female-friendly businesses.
Okay, I'd like to get started now. I'll be discussing advertising again today. Advertising, advertisers, and of course, ads. I think I ended last time by mentioning that we're seeing an explosion of advertising in our daily lives. And advertisements seem to be everywhere. So, for example, have you ever looked at the back of your receipt from the supermarket or your movie ticket? Those are now new places for advertisements. Now, some other new places we now see ads are on cars, in classrooms, at sports stadiums, and even we're starting to see them in restrooms. So we're talking about an overall increase in all kinds of advertising. So, what I want to do is discuss the causes of this increase in advertising. All right. I want to start by giving you an interesting statistic. Research has shown that in North America, the average person sees 3,000 ads per day. That's throughout the day, and that's inside and outside the house. But, and this is important, I want to stress that it's not just the number of ads that is increasing, it's the number of new kinds of advertising we were exposed to in our daily lives. I want to look at two kinds of advertising, two new kinds of advertising in detail. Okay? The first is new kind of public advertising, and the second is hidden advertising. Okay, let's talk about the first new kind of advertising. Now, of course, we've always had ads in public places, but we're now seeing many new kinds of ads that are placed in public places where there were no ads before. Now, we have even begun to see ads placed in elevators, on park benches, and even in schools. That's right, I said schools. Advertisers now go to some schools and offer to pay the school to let them promote their products on things the school gives to kids. So, for example, we might see kids in school carrying books with the logo of a shoe company on it. Now, that's a new type of public advertising. Okay. A second new type of ad is what I would call ads that don't seem like ads. Ads that don't seem like ads. They're hidden ads. So when we see this kind of ad, we don't even realize that it's an ad. Now, probably the best example of this type of ad is when you see a famous movie star or athlete being interviewed on television. Now, he or she is wearing, let's say, a t-shirt with the logo for a shoe company on it. Now, this doesn't seem at all like an advertisement, does it? But the way it works is, the shoe company paid the person to wear the shirt. They got money to promote the product. Now, that's a new kind of advertisement. And if you think about it, that's much more cost-effective for businesses to advertise that way than to make a real TV commercial, which is very expensive, as you probably know. Okay, now, there's another kind of hidden ad that doesn't seem like an ad. It's what we call product placement. Product placement. It's becoming more and more common. Now, product placement is when a company pays to have its product appear in a movie or a TV show. So, for example, let's say you're watching a movie and you see a man and a woman in a restaurant. Suddenly, the waiter arrives and serves a bottle of soda. Well, it seems normal, right? But if you can see the brand name of the company on the bottle, well, then that scene is an advertisement for the soda. So let's talk about these hidden ads from the perspective of advertising companies. Why? Because there's a lot of evidence that shows us that using all these places for advertising and using all these new kinds of advertising has been very good for advertisers. Yes, of course, we hear many people complain about advertisements in movie theaters or in schools. But for the advertisers, this innovative advertising has been very successful. Why is this true? Well, with much of the traditional advertising, say television commercials and print advertising like in magazines and the like, a person can choose to avoid the ad. They can change the channel on television, or they can turn the page of the magazine. And if they do that, they won't see the ad. But with many of these innovative approaches, many of these hidden advertisements, advertisers can advertise more and consumers will still pay attention. In fact, as you can see, they have no choice but to notice the ads. Smart, right? Let's look at how it works. I said that we are seeing advertising throughout the day, on television, at the supermarket, on the street. And I also said that most of us don't notice how much and how often companies are trying to sell us something, because many of these new ads are so hidden or so secret. So, in the long run, if the consumer is not aware of the advertiser is less likely to lose the consumer. The consumer won't run away. Okay, let's move on to discuss some of the reasons why we've seen this increase in new kinds of advertising. We really began to notice the increase in the 1990s. And one major cause was the spread of new kinds of entertainment. Let's follow this along. Since the 1990s, we've had many channels of cable TV, like MTV, CNN, or ESPN for sports. So, suddenly there were so many new channels, so much to see on television, and so many new and different programs. Now, we would probably agree that this sounds great for television watchers and great for advertisers, because they could have more places to show their ads. But almost the opposite turned out to be true, because with all the new channels, it was very easy for people to actually avoid seeing television commercials. So with all the choices of channels on TV, the result was consumers actually saw fewer ads. So, and this is important, here the result for advertisers was that they had to start looking for other places to advertise besides television. They had to become very innovative in finding new places to advertise. So that's one reason. Okay, I'd like to bring up another reason for the rise in advertising. It's technology. Technology. New developments in technology have led to new and unusual, some people might say strange, ways to advertise. And this again means more advertising. Take this example. I'm sure you've watched a baseball or football game on television. Maybe it looks like that soft drink ad is on the fence or on the grass, but it actually exists only on television. The people who are at the game see nothing on the fence. The ad is only visible when you watch the game on TV. So how is this possible? Well, you can tell. It's computers and all kinds of high-tech machines that have really created more and more opportunities for advertisers. Okay, now that's it for today. Hopefully I've shown you that advertising companies are spending a great deal of their time creating new and very interesting ways to advertise their products. So, I would say that all in all, this is an exciting time to be in the advertising world. Okay? I'll see you next time.
Okay, let's get started. So we're talking about work today. There's been a great deal of research about how people in the US work and how they think about their work. And one big question many researchers have is, are people working more hours than they did back in the 1970s? Or, now that we have all these time-saving technology like computers, cell phones, fax machines, are people in the US working fewer hours? That's the question for the researchers. And what I want to do today is discuss several aspects of the research on work habits. Okay. Well, it turns out that we don't actually have a clear picture of whether or not Americans are working more hours. We're just not 100% certain. And that's because when researchers ask people to just talk in a general way, when they ask them how much they work, like how many hours they work at the office, the results seem to show that yes, people work more hours than they used to. But when researchers ask people to keep a time diary of their work hours, that means they ask people to write down how many hours they work every day. Well, it turns out workers actually spend fewer hours working than they did 30 years ago. And as you might expect, this is very interesting to social scientists. Good. So, the really interesting thing that we see in these studies is that people think they are working more hours than they actually are. Now, before we move on, are there any questions or comments? Good. Okay. Now, the reason for this contrast of what Americans say and what they do is, well, in America, people seem to feel busier. They have a sense that there are so many things for them to organize and do. There seems to be, let's just call it a general sense of overall time pressure, meaning pressure to get everything done in time. I like to call this feeling of being busy. I just call it busyness. Here, let me write it for you. Okay. So, now I want to focus on a few causes for this increased feeling of busyness, this feeling of always being busy. So let's look at one cause. And to do that, let's analyze a change that happened in this country about 30 years ago or so. Back in the 1970s, more women than ever began to work outside of the home. They got jobs. So, since women were working, men had to take on new household responsibilities like taking care of the children, cooking, cleaning, you know. Now this, of course, meant that both women and men began to have two roles. Working out of the home at a job and working in the home, taking care of the family. Both men and women have to juggle the responsibilities of children, household chores, and work. So, you can see that men and women feel they're busier because they are doing more than just working at a job or just working at home. They're doing both. And they, as a result, they feel busy all the time. It's a pretty logical feeling. All right, now let's move on to discuss where people work. All right. Because that's another cause of this feeling of busyness. One of the trends that we see is that for many Americans, work is no longer limited to a job and a regular schedule. Now we have new technologies such as fax machines, pagers, email, and of course computers. And that means that people continue to do their work at home. So the traditional 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock workday is becoming a thing of the past now. It's not 9 to 5 for a lot of people now. That the workday can easily continue into the evening. So as a consequence, people are often doing housework and office work at the same time. And what's the result? Of course, they feel busier because of this. They feel like they're always working. And so there's that feeling of busyness again. Okay, now we've talked about the fact that many people's work is not limited to just one location and not limited to just the daytime. Let's now move on to talk about what is happening in the workplace. This is important to understand because changes in the American workplace have led to another cause of this feeling of busyness we're discussing. Here's what we see. These days, as you probably know, competition in the business world is tougher than ever. Companies have to produce more and spend less in order to stay competitive. And so, in many cases, workers have to work harder and work faster to help the company stay alive, to stay in business. So, when people are in the workplace, they face increased work pressure to work quickly and to produce more, speed up and do more. Workplace activities like writing a letter or having a meeting have to be done faster in order for the workplace to become more efficient. As a matter of fact, many experts who study the work trends agree that efficiency has become the number one value. All right. So now let's go inside the typical workplace to see what I mean. Okay. We all know that most offices have a fax machine and computers with email and the internet. And all this technology makes communication faster and faster. Well, what is the result? Well, it makes people, it means that people can make decisions more quickly and respond to decisions more immediately. They have to think and talk at the same time. All because there is less time and more pressure to get the work done. So, all of this created a faster paced workplace and workers who feel busy all the time. So in the end, the hours that people are working are busier. Their working hours are busier. Okay? Okay. Now, let's move on to another point. Even though Americans feel busy, research shows us that they actually really like their jobs. They do. In a large national poll of working Americans over the last 30 years, that's the time of all these changes in the workplace, researchers found that 9 in 10 Americans were either very satisfied or moderately satisfied. Okay. That means about 90% of Americans. That's a very high number. Are happy in their work situations, even though, as we said, they feel busier. We like our jobs. We like our jobs, and it's okay that we work more and feel busier. This certainly isn't true for everyone, but there is evidence that it is true for many people in the U.S. All right. It looks like we've got to stop now. This is really interesting, and I know more research in the near future will focus more specifically on this topic. Okay. That's it for today. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. What I want to talk about today is leisure time. In other words, how people in the U.S. spend their time when not working. But before we dive in to discuss leisure, let's first look briefly at how people spend their time at work. Let's see if how they work tells us anything about how they play during leisure time. Okay, now many people are in workplaces where efficiency is the number one value. American companies are constantly trying to increase efficiency. And recently, there are a lot of new technologies that make that possible. So people are working in workplaces in which there's a feeling of a sped up, that is, a quickened pace, which then leaves them with an overall feeling their life, even out of the workplace, is sped up. They have the feeling that there isn't enough time really to do the things they need to do. They especially have a feeling of not having enough time to relax. So, today we'll look at some current ways in which people who work in this sped up work world organize their leisure time, how they react to the sped up pace. And by current, I mean right now. These are some recent trends. So, today's focus is spending leisure time. Now, the first reaction to the sped up work pace is that we see people organizing or using their leisure time by trying to make it more efficient, just like at work. So first, let's look at this value of efficiency. Okay. The first example that I want to do is to look at how people in the U.S. take this value of efficiency and allow it to affect their leisure time while on vacation. So think for a second of a tourist site that maybe you have been to in the United States. Maybe you've been to the Grand Canyon, or the Golden Gate Bridge, or the Statue of Liberty. Yeah? Okay. Typical tourist sites. Okay. So at these sites, you see people spending time walking around, reading about the sites in their guidebooks, taking their time to really learn about the tourist site. But alternatively, you also see people trying to make their leisure time more efficient. So instead of spending time slowly looking at the site or even walking around, maybe you've seen what I've seen, which is people driving around the site with their video cameras out the window, right? So pointing the video camera out the window of a moving car, not even stopping to really see the site. Then maybe going to a second site and even a third site. This is the way they visit most places possible in a limited period of time. In other words, they are trying to play as efficiently as they work. You've seen this, yeah? Yeah. So that's an example of this first idea of efficiently using leisure time. Okay. I want to bring up one more way that people use leisure time efficiently. And that is, instead of trying to do a lot of things one after the other in one time period, just as I described, instead they multitask. For example, and listen to see if you hear yourself described in this. They're watching television while surfing the internet. Does this sound familiar? So in other words, they're trying to do multiple leisure activities at the same time. They're trying to do as much as possible in a limited amount of time. In fact, there is an interesting study that looked at how people entertain themselves during leisure time. And the results of the study showed that by multitasking like this, people are able to fit 11 hours of leisure time activities into 7 hours of actual leisure time. And one thing that I want to make sure that you notice here is that in all of these examples, what has made this efficiency or speed up possible is technology. The video camera, the cell phone, the computer, and the internet, etc. All of this makes it possible for leisure time to start to look exactly like work time. And that's another way that we see people bringing workplace values into their downtime. What I mean by downtime is this free time or relaxation time. Okay? Now, hopefully now you're all exhausted by the idea of this. It sounds really exhausting to spend your time like that. And in fact, what we see is that some people are just as stressed out or tense when they're trying to have fun as when they are working. But not everybody is busy and efficient all the time. So let's look at this second reaction to the sped up workplace. The newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, recently summarized 6 surveys that were done about how people spend their leisure time. And they found some interesting and I think important information that people are hurried at work and tired at home. And they found that many people actually choose to organize their leisure time in a kind of low energy choice. You can imagine what some of these are. People like to watch TV. They like to rest. And a lot of people said they like to read. So these kind of, the trend was for low energy or no-brainer choices. And of all these low energy choices, take a guess which one is the #1 leisure activity in the United States. Watching TV. And now, take a minute. How many hours a day do you guess Americans watch TV? 4 hours per day. If you guessed 4 hours per day, you are right. So, the #1 leisure activity then is watching TV. What is going on here? I think that what we see is that instead of staying just as busy during their free time, some people are so tired from working and juggling multiple tasks that they become couch potatoes. Couch potatoes. What do I mean by couch potatoes? Couch potatoes, get the picture here, are people who just want to sit on the couch and do nothing but watch TV and escape. Got it? Understand what I mean by couch potatoes? So, some people respond to a stressful work life by acting like couch potatoes. In other words, they respond in a very relaxed way versus the efficient way that I described earlier. And we can infer or guess that all these people are watching TV so much because TV provides an easy escape from the hurried pace of life, the hurried pace of work lives and busy home lives, and the constant decision-making required when people have to juggle multiple responsibilities. Okay. So, I'd like to wrap up today and make sure that you get the main point, which is that we see that this quickened pace of life today has produced 2 opposite reactions. Some people respond by playing just like they work, very efficiently, and others withdraw and do very little. Okay, that's it. We'll pick this up next week.
Good morning, everyone. Ready to get started? Okay, good. Our topic today is diet and health. Today we'll discuss the reasons people choose the food they eat. And what I mean is maybe they choose for nutrition, that is, getting the right type of food for good health and growth, or maybe they choose for pleasure, meaning they choose food because it tastes good. But before we go into why people choose the food they do, I'd like to give you some background and briefly explain 2 basic purposes of food. The first, and I might add the most basic reason that we eat food, is for nourishment. Let me explain this. How our bodies use food for nourishment. When we eat food, for example, have a meal of rice, meat, and vegetables, this food is not in the form that the body can use. It has to be changed by the body. This means changed into smaller molecules of nutrients before they can be taken in. And taken in merely means that the nutrients are absorbed into the blood and carried to the cells throughout the body. Does this process sound familiar to you? The process that I'm talking about is called, of course, digestion. Let's define digestion. Digestion is the process by which food and drink are broken down into their smallest parts, such as vitamins, nutrients, so that the body can use them to build and nourish cells and to provide energy. Okay, that's brief, but a little bit about the first purpose of food, nourishment. Let's look now at the second, and some might say a more powerful reason that we eat food. We eat food because it provides pleasure. You know what I'm talking about, right? To illustrate what I mean by pleasure, think of the good smell of food, the good taste of food, the appealing look of it, and even the feel of food. Pleasure and food have a strong connection for most people. Let me give you a few examples. We eat to celebrate. We eat to reward ourselves or others. You get the picture. My point here is that food and pleasure are closely connected. Let's look at how people choose food for nutrition. Where do people find information about what food is healthy and what food is not healthy? Well, people get this information about food and diet from a variety of sources. Let me give you a typical example. That is, the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA. This is a federal government agency that researches and gives advice and recommendations to people about health and diet issues. You've probably heard about the food pyramid that they publish, right? Well, as you might guess, people don't always listen and take this advice and make their food choices based on these studies. Why is this? Well, nutritional advice can be confusing for a variety of reasons. One reason is that there are a lot of studies with a lot of information about nutrition. Some findings in these studies are quite controversial. People find it hard to make sense of it. There's so much conflicting advice about good nutrition and a lot of marketing, a lot of advertising for food. All this information can tend to confuse people rather than help them, make good choices. I want to look at a perfect example of this point. Potato chips. Look at the potato chip shelf in any store and you're faced with a lot of choices. For example, you might see regular potato chips, low-fat chips, even no-fat chips, chips with salt, chips with low salt, and chips with no salt. There are chips made out of potatoes, sweet potatoes, and even rice. At least 9 choices. Wow, 9 choices, and I'm sure you can find more. How does a person decide what kind of chips to choose? He might read the label on the back of the bag, but even when we read the nutritional labels on the bags, the label that tells us about the fats, salt, and carbohydrates in the food, we're not sure how to balance this nutritional information and our desire for pleasure. So you can easily understand a person saying, I give up. It's just too hard to be healthy. I'm going to just choose the one that tastes the best, and it's just too much for me to understand and decide on. I want to move on and share a really interesting cross-cultural survey that was done by an American psychologist and a French sociologist on the differences between French and American attitudes towards food. Let's look in detail at one example of different attitudes. The French are more likely to choose food on the basis of pleasure. Yep, that's right, pleasure. And here's an interesting fact. The French are, in general, healthier and thinner than Americans. In contrast, they found that Americans have the opinion that certain foods, like fats, for example, are as bad as poison. Poison! And the interesting thing here is that even though they see it as poison, this doesn't stop them from eating the poison, that is the fat. But they eat it with two feelings, pleasure and guilt. Here's an example that helps us understand these attitudes. People in the survey were asked, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase chocolate cake? Listen again to the question. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase chocolate cake? Ready for the answer? The Americans were more likely to say guilt. The French said celebration. What can we learn from this? What explains the fact that the French eat unhealthy food and enjoy it more without so much guilt and stay healthier than Americans? One idea is that the French eat, but they eat with a strict set of rules. Here are some examples of what they mean, a few of the rules that influence their diet. They eat small portions. They don't go back for seconds, that is, more food. They don't snack, meaning eat between meals, and they rarely eat alone. The researchers thought this meant that the French focus not just on what they eat, but on how they eat and how they feel about eating. We might summarize the American approach as this. Americans tend to take a more nutritional point of view when making choices about their diet. That is, they focus on what they eat, and they have less strict social rules that influence their choices. Let's take a look at these habits. So Americans generally don't control portions, eat second helpings, snack between meals. So let's wrap up. You can see that choosing food is a quite complex process. To choose food wisely requires more than just understanding nutrition and digestion. Our choices are influenced by scientific information, pleasure, social habits, and feelings. And we need to understand all of these if we want to answer the question, how do people choose their food?
How is everybody today? Let's begin because we've got a lot to cover. Today, we are going to look at the problem of air pollution. And to understand air pollution, I want to look at one of the particularly harmful gases that causes it. So, that's where we'll start. And then we'll move on to discuss trees. Yes, that's right, trees. And we'll look at how trees are a great low-technology solution to air pollution. Okay, so we have these two areas to cover. Let's start by looking at air pollution in urban areas, that is, cities. What we see in urban areas is that air pollution can be especially intense because the human population in cities is so big. When we look at population statistics for an urban area worldwide, these numbers are interesting. The world population is over 6 billion in 2005. And of this 6 billion, almost 50% live in cities, Another way to say that is more than 3 billion people, 3 billion, live in cities. Why am I telling you these numbers? Let me explain why. It is important to understand these urban population statistics because when we look at the problems caused by air pollution in urban areas, we can see that in cities a huge number of people are affected by pollution. And we also see that it is the same huge number of people that cause the pollution as well. So cities are key places to look at the causes and effects of air pollution. So let's move now to look at some of the specific causes of air pollution. In order to give us an idea of how air pollution works, I want to explain the impact of one pollutant on air quality. The pollutant is a gas called sulfur dioxide. How many of you have heard of this? The chemical symbol for this is SO2. Sulfur dioxide is a mix of sulfur, the chemical symbol is S, and oxygen molecules. The chemical symbol is O2. The sulfur we are talking about is present in fuel. What I mean by fuel is material that is burnt to supply heat or power, like oil and coal. Okay, let's look at how SO2 is formed then. Let me put a slide up for you to look at while I explain the process, okay? Here it is. This shows 4 steps or so of the process. First, we have a fuel that contains sulfur and it is burned. The sulfur is released into the air. You can see it coming from these factories here. Next, the sulfur then mixes with oxygen in the air. This becomes SO2, sulfur dioxide. So, that is how it is formed. But let's look at what happens next. The SO2 then rises into the air. At this point, it mixes with water in the clouds. The mix forms a substance called sulfuric acid. And now, the sulfuric acid interacts with other gases in the air to form something called a sulfate. The 4th step shows that sulfuric acid then falls with the rest of the water in the clouds as something called acid rain. You've probably heard of this. This acid rain is extremely dangerous to the environment, land, and water. So, that's the process of how SO2 is formed and becomes acid rain. Let me spell out the problems sulfur dioxide can cause for both people and the environment. People exposed to SO2, many of them living in cities, have a difficulty with things like this: difficulty with breathing, watering eyes, and burning nose and throat. For some, these effects are temporary, but in other cases, SO2 can actually cause permanent damage. Now, let's look at the effects on the environment. Here are some examples. Sulfur dioxide in acid rain damages forests and growing things and even changes the soil. In other words, the ground the plants grow in. It also increases the acid level in water. By water, I mean oceans and lakes and streams. It makes them so acidic that fish and other living creatures cannot live in them. I think I've painted a general picture of how serious air pollution is. You have a pretty good idea of how terribly it affects every living thing. So, let's turn our attention to what's being done about this problem. Let's turn our focus to one unique solution. Let's talk about trees. Trees provide both environmental services and economic benefits. What does this mean? It means that trees actually help save money. I want to talk now about how trees help in and around densely populated urban areas. Let me start by defining an important term, and that is urban forests. The term urban forest means planting and maintaining individual trees and small forests in and around urban areas. For example, an urban forest can be tree-lined streets, trees in schoolyards, trees in downtown parks, and trees along the highways. You get the picture. So let me explain what these trees do to reduce pollution. First, trees absorb polluting gases through their leaves. They take in pollutants and break them down so that they're less harmful. You can think of trees working kind of like a sponge for various forms of pollution. So trees help reduce existing pollution. Trees are also helpful in preventing pollution from occurring. Trees actually help cities stay cooler by reducing high temperatures in general. How does this work? Trees, as you know, provide valuable shade. And shade is good because once the air is cooler, there is less of a need for using air conditioners. Some urban forest organizations claim that just only three well-placed trees around a home can lower air conditioning bills by up to 50%. This is amazing. Lowering home electricity bills is just part of the story of how trees help. Power plants that produce electricity are one of the biggest sources of SO2. Urban forestry is an international effort that you can see in cities all over the world. Let me give you a few examples. Beijing, China, Dublin, Ireland, and Mexico City, to name just a few, all have significant urban forestry programs. I'm going to stop here today, but I hope to leave you with an understanding of one polluting gas, sulfur dioxide, and the advantages of trees and the urban forest.
All right, let's get going. I've got a lot of material to get through today. So, let's go back to our discussion of the news media and how people get their news. And yeah, this turns out to be a very interesting topic because we are seeing a significant change in the way people get their news these days. And it's important to note that this change, like so many other trends we see today, has a lot to do with the internet. So what I want to do today is I want to cover several aspects of this trend and talk about what this means for news. Now we see the number of people actually getting the news from print media is declining. It's dropping. And the internet is quickly becoming an important source of news for more and more people. Okay? Great. Now, let me move on to give you some statistics on this trend. I want you to pay attention to this. Researchers noticed that in 2000, about 70% of the people they asked said that newspapers were an important source of information for them. So 70% said reading the paper was important. In 2003, that number dropped to 51%. 51%. That's a pretty significant decline. And I'm willing to bet that that number is even lower now. So, now I'm looking at this room full of college students. Most of you are between 18 and 24. And my guess is that most or maybe all of you use the internet. The reason I'm talking about your age group is that you represent the new trend away from newspapers and toward the internet. You are the trend. And experts predict that this trend away from newspapers will continue as more and more young people grow up using the internet to do so many things. Let me spell this out a little more for you. There was a key study of young people done in 2004. And for this study, they interviewed 35 to 54-year-olds who read the newspaper. And they asked them if the newspaper was an important part of their day. Well, 38% of them said yes. But, when they asked 18 to 24-year-old newspaper readers the same question, only 17% of them said yes. Only 17%. This is big news. All right. So to be sure, there is a move away from the traditional way that people have gotten their news. Okay. Let's move on to why this trend is happening. So, why? Now, many young people say that they prefer internet news because it's a fast way to keep up with events. Now, that's probably true. But there are a couple of other significant reasons why news on the internet is gaining popularity. One is simply that news on the internet is more up to date. It's the most current information. That's a significant difference from the news you read in the newspaper that comes out once a day and stays the same for 24 hours. Now, a second feature of internet news is it gives people the ability to get informed about any kind of news, weather, world events, traffic, news that is more in-depth than in a newspaper. So, the bottom line here is, internet news is more complete. With an online newspaper, for example, you can begin to read a news story, go to a related audio or video link, and so on. You can keep going and get more information. Now, let's move on to another attraction of the internet. I want you to notice I keep talking about links. That's because on the internet, those links are there and you decide how much you want to learn and you decide what kind of news you want to get. So, the internet is interactive. In other words, there is communication between the person looking for news and the website. Again, you, the internet user, control the news you get. Now, I want to point out that this movement to internet news has obviously made a lot of people excited, but it's also made some experts who study the media, well, it's made them worried. Some of their concerns are the flip side, meaning the opposite of the attractions we talked about earlier. For example, I mentioned that internet news is fresh, it's up to date. Well, the downside, that is, the negative side of this, is that reporters writing the news for the internet must work extremely quickly to research, write, and get the news on the internet as soon as possible. So, in this rush to get the news onto the internet, it's easy for the reporters to make mistakes or maybe leave out some important information. So, media experts are concerned that internet news might sometimes be less accurate and less reliable than newspaper news. So that's one possible downside of internet news. Okay. Now, here's another possible problem. We said before that many internet users really enjoy controlling their news. Maybe that sounded good, right? But the worry for media experts is the possibility that internet users will limit their news too much. They won't know everything they should. Now, this is a crucial idea. And the idea is that people who get their news on the internet may only learn what they want to learn and miss other important information that they should know. All right. Now, I want to bring up another concern, and it's related to the previous one. It has to do with this idea of limiting what news you get on the internet, right? So, right now, let's take a look at this. Okay. It's the front page of a newspaper. It's a typical front page of a newspaper. Here you see all kinds of news, just on the front page. International, national, local news. And you can also find out right away what news is most important. The important news has a bigger headline. Here it is, at or near the top of the page. And maybe it's longer. Look at this headline. You know by where it's at that it's the most important news. It's more important than the other news. But when you get the news online, you tend to see something like a list. A list, line, line, line of headlines to choose. You don't always know what's important. So the worry is that internet news readers will have much less information about the important things they need to find out in today's news. So what I'm saying is, some experts fear that online news readers will be less informed citizens who who might not participate as much in their communities. In other words, if people know less about the world around them, then they might not vote, say, or help make other decisions in their communities. They just won't be as interested in the events going on around them. That's the fear. All right, I see our time is almost up. Well, I want to stress that the trend away from newspapers to the internet is happening right in front of us. And as students of the media, you may or may not agree with some of the concerns of the researchers, but it certainly offers us a lot to think about. Okay, I'll see you guys next time.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Our topic, once again, is television. And today, I'm going to cover the health of characters on television, and then talk about how television programs deal with health. Now, it turns out to be a useful way to understand the power of television media. Okay, first of all, I'd like to point out that almost all characters on TV are healthy. So even when we see a violent act on television, like a shooting or a car crash, we rarely see people in pain or people suffering. Okay? Now, most characters on TV, as I said, are healthy, and they rarely get hurt, or they rarely get into accidents. So, for instance, even when we see those fast and dangerous car chases, where a car or two cars are going extremely fast down a city street or down small streets onto the sidewalk, we might not see the car crash, but if it does crash, we rarely see people get hurt, even when they do something extremely dangerous. All right? So let's talk about eating and drinking on TV. Now that's an interesting topic, because we see a lot of eating and drinking on TV, but often when we see people eating on TV, they're not eating healthy foods. They're eating really bad foods. What do I mean? Well, first of all, we see many characters who eat too much food, or they eat a lot of candy and drink too much coffee. But even though these eating habits are unhealthy, there are very few fat or unhealthy people shown on television. Okay? So, in other words, everybody seems healthy on television, even if they shouldn't be. Now let's talk about one more health idea, and that's the big one because it's really changed so much, and it's a very important idea. Okay, now when I was young, when I was a child, almost everybody on TV smoked. Now I bet that's difficult for you to believe, because now smoking has almost completely disappeared from television, unless of course you watch an old movie. Okay, now that's going to be it for today. And we'll pick up this discussion next time with another television theme. Okay? Good morning. Okay, let's go ahead and begin class. Well, we're beginning to narrow our discussion of media images. And today we'll be talking about television a little more carefully. And in this case, we're talking about television dramas and comedies. Now, before I go on, I want to stress that the reason I'm talking about television today is because most of us get our entertainment from television, right? So, just for a minute, listen to this statistic. The general public in the United States watches almost 30 hours of TV per week. Did you get that? Almost 30 hours. Now that's truly a lot of exposure to TV and to TV images. And that's probably a surprise to most people in the US. So let me start by bringing up the point that we tend to take TV and the images it gives us for granted. Now what I mean is, most people are not really aware of the patterns, meaning the similar types of characters that we see in television dramas and comedy. And we aren't conscious of the stereotypes. And the interesting thing for us is that many media experts will say that these characters, even though they're fictional, meaning they're not real, can influence how the public thinks about people who are in the real world. And as you might then expect, they can influence the real world itself. So I want you to come away from today's lecture understanding that experts in our field of media studies believe more and more that TV can cause people to confuse reality with what they see on television. Now, as students of the media, for you, understanding the power of the media and the images in the media is really crucial for you. So let me give you the term we use for understanding the power of media. It's called media literacy.